Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more Mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams.
There are moments in a life when the world seems to stand completely still, when the air holds its breath, and even the city refuses to speak. On a winter night, in the late 1980s, Terry Flenory stood beneath a flickering streetlight on the west side of Detroit, wrapped in that kind of silence. Frost clung to the corners of parked cars. Thin smoke drifted from chimneys 2 blocks away, and the streetlight above him buzzed like a tired old memory trying to stay alive. He was young then, barely past boyhood, but something about the way he carried himself made the night. Lean in and listen. The city around him was a place of contradictions, loud in the daytime, softened at night, always struggling to remember what it once hoped to be. Factories sat like rusted skeletons along the horizon. Sidewalks cracked under the weight of winters that arrived too early and stayed too long. And in this landscape, Terry walked with quiet purpose. Not the swagger of the spotlight, not the bravado people would one day associate with BMF, but something slower, steadier, more deliberate. A kind of awareness born from growing up in a place that demanded you pay attention or get swallowed. He wasn't yet the figure whispered about Bates across states. He wasn't Southwest T, the man whose presence could shift a room. He was just Terry, sharp-eyed, careful, the type of young man who listened twice before he spoke once. People often say cities shape destinies, but for Terry, it was the spaces between those cities, the unlit corners, the empty lots, the quiet exchanges of everyday survival that carved him into the kind of person who could build an empire without needing to stand in front of it, even as a child. He had a softness in his voice that made people underestimate the steel underneath. Where his brother Meech radiated heat, big dreams, big charm, big energy, Terry carried something cooler. He moved like the shadow that followed light, never asking for attention, but always knowing exactly where he stood. In that balance, something powerful was beginning to form. Not ambition in the loud, dramatic sense, but ambition like a seed, silent, patient, waiting for the right season. Detroit, in those years, was a city caught between the memory of what it had been and the truth of what it was becoming. Families worked hard just to break even. Entire neighborhoods whispered stories about what you could gain or lose by stepping onto the wrong path. Terry grew up hearing those whispers, not with fear, but with understanding. He learned early that the world didn't give chances freely. You carved them out. You built them from scraps. You held on to them even when they tried to slip through your fingers. The street where he stood that night held echoes of childhood. Afternoons spent watching older kids hustle, argue, chase dreams that never seemed to cross the city limits. Terry saw everything, even before he understood its meaning. He saw how respect could be currency, how silence could be power, how moving carefully could be the difference between rising and falling. There were lessons hidden in every corner of Detroit, and he absorbed them without needing to be told. But he didn't crave the glow of recognition. He wasn't drawn to chaos. He wasn't driven by the hunger for control. His motivations were simpler, but no less powerful. Responsibility, family, stability, things that felt heavy and precious in equal measure. And though he didn't know it yet, these qualities would eventually make him the counterbalance to Meech's fire, the shadow that kept the flame from burning too far, too fast. The cold wind brushed against him as he leaned against a lamppost, hands tucked into his jacket. Across the street, A corner store stood with its metal gate halfway down, orange light spilling from the cracks. Cars passed occasionally, slowing just enough to reveal the tired faces behind their windows. Detroit didn't hide its reality. It wore it plainly like a coat too heavy to remove, but too cold to survive without. Terry watched it all quietly. He had always watched. Even back when he and Meech were boys, sharing a bedroom, he observed the world with a kind of thoughtful distance, while Meech dreamed out loud, talking about futures bigger than anything their neighborhood had ever seen. Terry imagined stability, precision, a life where every choice was measured. Their bond was deep, unshakable, but their visions of the world were shaped by different rhythms. On this particular night, the city felt like it was holding something just out of reach. Terry couldn't name it yet, but he sensed the shift, not dramatic or explosive, but subtle, like a current beneath still water. He felt the weight of decisions he hadn't made yet, opportunities he didn't know were coming, and the faint stirrings of a path that would one day stretch far beyond the cracked streets around him. Behind him, the streetlight flickered again, briefly casting his shadow long and thin across the pavement. It stretched toward the darkness, merging with it, becoming part of something larger than the boy who made it. Terry glanced at it, then at the road ahead, where the neighborhood dipped into silence. A silence that wasn't empty, but waiting. He took a breath, and the cold air stung his lungs. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed long, lonely, cutting through the night like a reminder that the world beyond Detroit still existed. He wondered what it held for him. He wondered if the life he knew was the one he was meant to. Keep that. Then he stepped away from the streetlight. It was a small movement barely noticeable to anyone who might have been watching, but it carried the weight of a beginning. A quiet beginning. The kind that doesn't announce itself with fireworks or warnings. The kind that feels like nothing and becomes everything. As he walked, the streetlight behind him buzzed once more, then dimmed, its glow flickering like a sign that could be read in two ways, a warning or a blessing. And Terry, without knowing which it was, kept walking into the darkness that would one day be his empire, long before the world attached titles to their names, before empires and rumors and the mythology that would surround them. Terry and Meech were simply two brothers, sitting at the edge of their shared dreams. Their beginnings did not burst into existence with noise or spectacle. They arrived quietly, like dawn creeping through a half-closed curtain, soft but undeniable. In those early years, their home was small, but the ideas they whispered inside it were anything but. The living room often smelled of old books, warm food, and the faint scent of winter air slipping through the window frame. At night, when the house settled into silence, the two brothers would sit beneath a dim lamp whose yellow glow softened their expressions. It was there, in those gentle hours, that the blueprint of their future slowly took shape. Meech spoke first, always. His voice carried an energy that wrapped around the room, filling it with color. He had a talent for imagining things that didn't yet exist, possibilities, opportunities, entire futures that shimmered in the space between his words. Terry listened, as he always did, absorbing each idea with the steady patience of someone measuring the weight of every thought. They were different in ways that complemented each other. Meech, magnetic and expressive, and Terry, observant and grounded. Where one saw a door, the other saw what it took to unlock it safely. Where one felt instinct, the other studied structure. And in that balance, something rare formed. A partnership not built on obligation, but on instinctive trust. Late nights became their classroom. The brothers would lean over a small table, sketching out the shape of survival. With whatever tools they had, quiet discussions. Bits of knowledge passed from older friends. The hard-earned wisdom of watching their neighborhood change year after year. They didn't talk in terms of risk or danger. They talked in terms of necessity, of taking control in a world that often made young men feel powerless. Their bond was not defined by the streets outside, but by the understanding between them. Meech dreamed aloud, his gestures wide, animated by optimism. Terry sat back, considering each possibility with a quiet intensity, turning ideas over like stones to see what lay beneath. Together, they began to imagine a different way forward, not one handed to them, but one they would build with their own hands. Detroit outside their window told a harsher story. Factories that once roared with life now stood silent. Families worked 2 jobs just to keep the heat on. The city felt caught between eras, struggling to hold on to a heartbeat that kept slipping away. The boys felt that tension, the sense of being born into a place that demanded strength simply to stay afloat. But instead of allowing the weight to crush them, they leaned into each other, creating a small refuge where hope could survive. There were evenings when Meech would pace across the room, speaking in rushing streams about what they could become. Terry would watch him, eyes sharp, recognizing the fire in his brother's spirit. It was a fire that could illuminate or consume, and he knew, even then, that part of his role was to temper it, not to dim it, but to guide it. The blueprint they formed was never drawn on paper. It lived in conversations, in unspoken agreements, in the quiet certainty that whatever path they took, they would take it together. Their early steps were small, so small that they barely recognized them as steps at all. But each choice, each moment of confidence, laid a brick in a road that would eventually stretch far beyond anything they could imagine. They did not speak of power, not yet. They spoke of survival, of dignity, of creating a life where their family wouldn't have to weather the uncertainties that seemed to define every season. Meech saw the potential, Terry saw the structure, and in that synergy, the outline of a future began to flicker into view. Sometimes, after their long conversations, the brothers would sit in silence, not the silence of emptiness, but of understanding, to minds aligning without needing words. Terry would lean back in his chair, feeling the soft hum of the lamp above him. Meech would exhale, his energy finally settling into something reflective. These were the moments when their bond felt strongest, shaped not by ambition, but by the simple truth that they needed each other. Outside, the wind would press against the window pane. A train would groan in the distance. The city moved slowly through the night, unaware that 2 brothers in a small room were stitching together the foundation of something that would one day shift the contours of entire regions. But inside, everything felt suspended. 2 young men balancing hope and uncertainty, instinct and caution, dream and discipline. As time passed, their discussions shifted from ideas to decisions. Small ones at first: who to trust, which opportunities carried promise, which paths carried danger disguised as potential. Terry spoke more then, offering insights that steadied Meech's enthusiasm. Meech listened, respecting the clarity in his brother's reasoning. Together, they made choices not with impulsiveness, but with an almost architectural attention to detail. They did not yet understand the magnitude of what they were building. They only knew that it felt like something alive, something fragile, but growing. Their early moves were quiet, discreet, guided by instinct, and strengthened by loyalty. Each one brought a mixture of excitement and unease, as though they were stepping into a world that welcomed them with one hand and warned them with the other. Yet the bond between them remained their anchor. In a city filled with unpredictability, their partnership felt like the one constant they could rely on. The warmth of brotherhood wrapped around them, even as the shadows of Detroit whispered of harder choices ahead. One night, after a particularly long conversation, they left their home and walked together through the fading darkness. The sky above them was pale, washed with the first hints of morning. Their silhouettes moved side by side, steady, aligned, unaware of how far their footsteps would travel. The street was quiet, but the future, waiting beyond the horizon, was anything but. And as the brothers walked home, their breaths soft in the cold air, neither could see the long road unfolding before them, one that would test their unity, deepen their bond, and eventually define their legacy. Terry Flenory never needed a crowd to feel certain of his direction. While some men pulled energy from the noise of the world, Terry found clarity in silence. He was most himself in the quiet hours when the city exhaled, when the streets thinned, when the distractions softened into a distant hum. That was when his mind opened, sharp and deliberate, arranging thoughts the way others arranged tools in a workshop. In those early years, when nothing was yet defined but everything was possible, Terry became the architect of the unseen. He did not stand in front of rooms, commanding attention with a voice that carried. He did not gesture wide or speak with the kind of charisma that made people lean closer. Instead, he observed, calculated, and built structures that others couldn't yet see. Every decision he made, every pattern he noticed, every risk he measured, these became the quiet bones of what would someday grow into something far larger. His world often began with a table, a simple one-worn wood, faint scratches, a corner that dipped slightly lower than the rest. But on that table, Terry laid out more than papers. He laid out possibilities, routes sketched in pencil, notes scribbled in margins, numbers arranged with the careful precision of someone who understood that a single miscalculation could unravel an entire future. The smell of fresh ink lingered around him, mixing with the cool metal tang of folding chairs and the faint scent of winter drifting through a cracked window. Sometimes, as he worked, a clock ticked softly on the wall. Its steady rhythm grounded him, each second reminding him that time itself was part of the equation. Timing, patience, the slow rhythm of choosing wisely rather than quickly. Terry understood, even then, that building anything meaningful required restraint. And he carried that understanding with a quiet confidence that didn't need validation. Meech moved differently. He walked into rooms and shifted the energy simply by being there. People were drawn to him, pulled in by his spirit, his fearlessness, his sense of possibility. Terry admired that about his brother. It was a fire he didn't possess, but one he respected deeply. Yet behind that fire, behind the charisma, and the expanding circle of influence, someone needed to manage the structure that held everything together. That burden fell naturally to Terry, not because anyone demanded it, but because his mind insisted on order. He could sense weak spots others couldn't. He could read the unspoken, risks beneath opportunities that seemed promising on the surface. And in those early days, when every step felt like the beginning of something fragile, Terry's precision became their anchor. He noticed patterns in things that looked random movements, behaviors, rhythms of the streets. While others saw chaos, Terry saw formulas. He memorized time frames, tracked tendencies, understood when to move and when to wait. To some, it looked like caution. To those who knew him, it was brilliance in disguise. As Meech's charm drew more people into their orbit, Terry became increasingly protective of the foundation. He refined routes, established systems, calculated margins with the kind of clarity that only comes from intuition shaped by discipline. Meech built momentum. Terry built stability. Meech created vision. Terry created structure. Together, they shaped something neither could have built alone. But even as their roles settled naturally, a subtle tension began to form. Nothing confrontational, nothing sharp. Simply a divergence of philosophies that whispered beneath their conversations. Meech believed in visibility, in widening circles, in expanding influence with bold confidence. Terry believed in shadows, in staying 2 steps removed from attention, in letting silence do the work that noise rarely could. Their differences were not obstacles, not yet. At this stage, they strengthened one another. Their opposing instincts filled in each other's blind spots. Still, Terry could sense the shift. Meech was becoming magnetic to more than just opportunity. Attention followed him like a shadow. Eyes lingered where Terry preferred. They didn't. And though it wasn't yet a threat, Terry understood that attention, any attention, came with cost. He didn't resent it. He simply noted it, the way he noted everything, quietly, without judgment. storing it in a place where instinct and foresight met. His role was not to stop the fire. His role was to keep it from burning out of control. There were evenings when Meech returned home, buzzing with stories, laughter still clinging to him, excitement sparking from every word. Terry listened, offering a small smile, while his mind sifted through the details that mattered. Sometimes he agreed. Sometimes he gently redirected, but always, beneath their conversations, lay the unspoken understanding that Terry would find the structure that made Meech's ideas sustainable. When the house finally grew quiet and Meech fell asleep, Terry's night often continued. He would sit alone at the kitchen table, the lamp above him casting a warm circle of light that felt like a small island in an otherwise dark room. Papers spread before him, some crisp, some worn at the edges. Numbers, arrows, names, sequences. He studied them with the patience of someone who knew that clarity never arrived in haste. Outside, the city moved slowly, breathing in long, heavy stretches. A dog barked in the distance. A car rolled past, its tires whispering across the cold pavement. The world beyond his window felt vast and unpredictable. But inside that small circle of lamplight, Terry was creating order, quiet, deliberate, calculated order. He did not do it for glory. He did not do it for the thrill of danger. He did it because his mind refused to accept uncertainty without first understanding it. Precision, for him, was not a skill, it was a way of surviving. Hours passed, sometimes without him noticing. His pencil would tap softly against the paper as he thought, paused, corrected, reworked. The lamp hummed faintly above him, and in those solitary moments, Terry felt the weight and the promise of the future pressing against his shoulders, not heavy enough to break him, but solid enough to remind him of the stakes. As dawn approached, he leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a rare, brief moment of stillness. The world outside was turning pale, the first hints of morning stretching across the sky. He rubbed his eyes, gathering the papers into neat stacks, committing the final arrangements to memory. He didn't know how far these calculations would eventually take them. He didn't know how much would be built on the foundation he shaped alone in the quiet. But he knew one truth with certainty. Empires are not only born from fire. Sometimes they are built in small rooms, under soft lights, by men who whisper their plans into the silence. And there, in the fading glow of the kitchen lamp, Terry Flenory continued building one number, one thought, one quiet decision at a time. Expansion never begins with noise. It begins with motion, quiet, steady, almost imperceptible at first. A car rolling down a long stretch of highway. A phone vibrating on a bedside table in a dim motel room. A map folded and unfolded until the creases become part of the story. These were the sounds of BMF stepping beyond Detroit, reaching toward a country that seemed larger, hungrier, and waiting. For Terry, expansion did not feel like a leap. It felt like a puzzle widening at the edges, piece by piece. Detroit had been familiar, turn its rhythms, its roots, its shadows, but beyond it lay cities whose names he had only traced with a fingertip, trying to imagine their pace, their patterns, their unspoken rules. He approached them the same way he approached everything, quietly, with patience, with an eye toward balance rather than ambition. On the road, time had a strange elasticity. Days blurred into one another, stitched together by white lines on dark pavement. Terry drove with the discipline of a man counting his own heartbeats. Every rest stop smelled of gasoline and rain-soaked asphalt. Every motel carried the same quiet hum behind the walls, a reminder that life moved even when he could not see it. These travels were not glamorous. They were measured, intentional steps taken not for show, but for stability. While others spoke of expansion as rise and conquest, Terry thought of it as alignment. A system is only strong when every part knows its role, when movement is coordinated, when nothing is left to improvisation. So he observed, he listened. He studied the way money moved in different states, the way people responded to risk, the way cities breathed after midnight, and slowly, almost invisibly, he began building. Routes were redrawn with the precision of an engineer. Networks formed like quiet constellations, points of connection illuminated through trust, consistency, and efficiency. Terry treated logistics like mathematics. Solve for distance, solve for time, solve for exposure. Every decision was tested against probability and consequence. He asked, not what was possible, but what was sustainable. Growth, to him, was not an explosion. It was a careful unfolding. Meech felt the expansion differently. For him, the spread across states carried an electricity he could taste in the air. New cities meant opportunity, influence, rooms where his presence could change the energy the moment he walked in. He sensed culture shifting around him: music, nightlife, visibility. He saw their reach, not just in numbers, but in atmosphere. And he moved through these growing circles with the confidence of someone who believed. Expansion was destiny. But destiny has different meanings, depending on who holds it. In those early expansion years, their strengths complemented each other like two halves of a clock. Meech driving momentum, Terry maintaining precision. BMF stretched outward with an almost corporate discipline. Meetings felt like boardroom strategy sessions. Logistics resembled supply chains. Their organization carried an internal order that puzzled outsiders, who expected chaos but found coordination instead. And yet, beneath the quiet success, subtle shifts were beginning. With expansion came distance, not only in miles, but in perspective. The brothers rarely moved together now. One was learning the pulse of Atlanta, while the other mapped routes through the Carolinas. One navigated rooms filled with music, faces, and possibility, while the other sat in the stillness of hotel desks, analyzing numbers deep into the night. Their communication, once constant, became a series of brief exchanges, often compressed into the spaces between responsibilities. The difference was not conflict, not yet. It was texture, like a faint vibration beneath the floorboards, noticeable only if you stood still long enough. Terry felt it most acutely in the moments between tasks, when the machinery of expansion paused just long enough for reflection. In quiet motel rooms, he sometimes wondered if distance had a sound, if separations began, not with arguments, but with silence. Still, the work demanded focus, and Terry remained steady. He carried leadership in a way that did not seek acknowledgement. His guidance was firm, measured, and always rooted in clarity. Those who worked with him understood the weight of his expectations. Precision was not optional. Discipline was not negotiable, and loyalty meant more than proximity. He believed that an expanding world required an anchored mind. He carried that responsibility without complaint, because to him, it was simply part of the architecture. Yet with every city they added to their network, Terry felt a subtle shift within himself, an awareness that scale brought vulnerability, growth created possibility, but it also stretched the distance between pieces, and distance created risk. He watched carefully for signs of instability, scanning for weaknesses not yet spoken aloud. It was not fear. It was vigilance and instinct shaped by a lifetime of considering consequences before they arrived. Sometimes, during those long drives between cities, he would lower the window just enough to let in the cool rush of highway air. The smell of night carried different notes in different states. Spine in the Carolinas, dust in Texas, warm humidity in Georgia. Each scent reminded him of motion, of change, of the strange duality of building something larger than oneself while trying not to lose oneself in the process. Meech, meanwhile, embraced visibility with a confidence that radiated. His presence in new cities drew attention not only from business partners, but from artists, promoters, dreamers. He understood culture in a way Terry never sought to. Where Terry saw risk, Meech saw reach. Where Terry saw exposure, Meech saw influence. Their interpretations weren't oppositions. They were reflections of who they had always been. But reflections can distort as distance grows. By the time BMF became a national force, the brothers were no longer simply expanding outward. They were expanding apart. Not deliberately, not dramatically, but gradually. Like two roads that once ran parallel and slowly curved in different directions. The chapter closes on a quiet night in an unfamiliar city, a night Terry would remember, not for its events, but for its stillness. He stood near the window of a high-rise apartment, the city stretching out below him in muted constellations of light. The glass felt cool under his fingertips. The horizon seemed to pulse with possibility and uncertainty at once. He watched the city breathe. He listened to its distant hum. He felt the weight of the empire they were building, steady, vast, and unstoppable. But he also felt the widening space between himself and the brother he had always walked beside. The expansion years had brought growth. They had brought opportunity. They had brought a new sense of scale. But they had also brought a quiet truth. The larger the empire became, the more room there was for distance to settle in, and for the first time, Terry wondered whether expansion was something that strengthened every bond or something that slowly reshaped them. The night had a pulse all its own, quiet yet insistent, like the hum of a distant engine in an empty parking lot. Terry Flenory moved through it with a kind of practiced invisibility, a shadow tracing the edges of rooms that were otherwise alive with light. The music from the party inside spilled into the street, muffled but insistent, vibrating faintly against the cold brick of the buildings around him. Glasses clinked, laughter rose and fell, voices overlapping like fragments of a conversation Terry could almost understand, if only he chose to. But he didn't. He let the moments wash over him from a distance. Standing at the boundary of attention and absence, Meech was in the center, as always. He drew people in like a magnet, charismatic, commanding, unafraid of the spotlight. Terry watched him from the periphery, noting how effortlessly the room bent toward his brother's energy. The way Meech smiled, the way he nodded, the ease with which he navigated the currents of conversation, it was artistry. And Terry, quiet, calculating, aware of every detail, felt a pang of something almost like grief, the subtle realization that the world they had built together had begun to unfold in divergent directions. Meech's brilliance now came with exposure, public eyes, whispered curiosity, the kind of attention that could dismantle everything they had worked for. And Terry, ever the strategist, could not ignore the risk. He remembered the early nights, the dimly lit rooms where every decision was measured, every move deliberate. The city had been a landscape of shadows then, and they had moved through it together, cautious and aligned. Now, the shadows were no longer theirs to command. They existed independently, and Terry's place in them had shifted. He felt it in the rhythm of his breath, in the quiet tightening of his chest, in the way his gaze lingered on Meech as he navigated another conversation with an unfamiliar associate. Admiration and fear coexisted, woven tightly, impossible to separate. It was not resentment, not yet. Terry's heart was full of loyalty, of love, of a recognition that Meech's path was as necessary as his own. But the subtle divergence was undeniable. The empire they had built together had become a prism, refracting into two distinct shapes. Meech's world was incandescent, brimming with spectacle and immediate influence. Terry's remained methodical, structured, invisibly its power, quiet, but no less absolute. He knew, with the clarity that came only from decades of measured decisions, that the strength of their partnership relied on the balance of these forces, and yet, balance required constant attention. He drifted to the edge of the balcony, the city's neon bleeding into the night, reflections rippling on puddles and glass alike. The laughter from below seemed distant now, almost otherworldly. The smells of spiced air and asphalt mingled with the faint tang of liquor and perfume, layering over one another like a memory he could almost touch. Terry's fingers traced the cold railing absent-mindedly, his mind cataloging the subtle shifts he had been feeling for weeks. Every choice Meech made in the public sphere sent ripples into their carefully ordered world. And Terry, in his quiet observation, began to understand that some ripples were beyond his control. The duality of admiration and concern settled into a slow, rhythmic ache. Terry acknowledged the truth he had long avoided, that leadership could manifest in contrasting ways, and that brilliance in one form often casts shadows in another. Meech's visibility was a gift, and it was also a vulnerability, and somewhere between those 2 points lay Terry's own quiet stewardship, a responsibility no one applauded, but which he bore with unwavering resolve. In the subtlety of his position, he found purpose, and in that purpose, he found an uneasy peace. But tonight, the tension was tangible, as if the air itself had thickened. Conversations overlapped, laughter trailed into silence, and Terry felt the weight of anticipation pressing against his shoulders. He could sense that every gesture, every nod, every fleeting glance contained meaning beyond the immediate. The party was a stage, and Meech the unspoken lead. And yet, Terry realized, the narrative of their lives was now written in 2 voices, harmonizing at times, clashing at others, each shaping the legacy they were building together. The cold seeped through his jacket as he stepped onto the street, the city exhaling around him. Neon signs flickered, painting his face in transient color, shadows stretching and bending along the pavement. He paused, listening to the faint echo of music and laughter, a world both familiar and distant. It was here, in this quiet, in the pause between the hum of celebration and the whisper of wind, that Terry recognized the full weight of their divergence, not as a fracture, not as betrayal, but as a natural consequence of 2 minds navigating a shared empire in distinct ways. He inhaled deeply, letting the chill fill his lungs, grounding himself in the moment. The air carried the scent of rain yet to come, of asphalt and neon, of nights that would be remembered only in fragments. Terry understood that the world they had built was larger than either of them alone, but that each step forward now required acknowledgement of difference. The choices Meech made in the spotlight would ripple, and Terry's work in the shadows would absorb them, mitigate them, account for them. For a long moment, he stood there, solitary yet intrinsically linked, hearing the faint echo of celebration through the cold night. There was sadness, yes, for the subtle narrowing of their paths. There was pride, too, for what they had accomplished together. And there was clarity, the quiet, undeniable truth that the Empire now carried multiple meanings, multiple interpretations, each shaped by the hand that guided it. Terry turned, taking one last look at the neon blur behind him, and walked further into the night, embracing the distance not as separation, but as understanding. Somewhere between the warmth of the rooms he left behind and the chill of the streets ahead, he found a fleeting equilibrium, the lines between light and shadow, visibility and discretion, admiration and concern had begun to blur. And in that blur, Terry realized, lay the future he would shape precisely, patiently, quietly, in ways the world might never see. And with that understanding, he stepped forward, into the cold, into the quiet, into the uncharted spaces of the empire they had built together, an empire now carrying different meanings for each of them. The city glittered as though it had been stitched from light itself, each street lamp, neon sign, and polished window reflecting 1,000 fragments of ambition. Terry Flenory moved through it quietly, a spectator to the spectacle, feeling the pulse of a world both familiar and disorienting. Inside the high-rise banquet hall, laughter ricocheted against marble columns, champagne glasses clinked, and music floated over the crowd like an invisible current. Meech, radiant in the center, commanded the room not with words alone, but with presence, every gesture, every glance amplified, magnified by the attention that followed him like a shadow. Terry lingered at the edge, a measured observer, cataloging each reflection with careful precision. Faces blurred together, mirrors multiplying the image of success until it became untethered from reality. He noticed the way people leaned in, eyes bright with curiosity or admiration. Not truly seeing the men behind the legend, only the myth that was forming. Terry's role had always been subtle. The architecture of operations, the hidden calculus of risk and reward. And now, in these mirrored spaces, he felt the gulf between action and perception stretching wider, the legend of BMF growing faster than the men who had created it. The air in these gatherings was heavy, with celebration yet fragile, like glass ready to shatter under the slightest touch. Terry understood the cost of every smile that greeted them, every toast lifted in their honor. Reputation, he knew, was a mirror. It reflected not only triumph, but every vulnerability, every flaw, carefully concealed. Meech's charm was a beacon, drawing attention and opportunity. And yet, it also illuminated the risks Terry had long tried to contain. Risks born not from recklessness, but from the exposure of their names. He drifted through the crowd silently, each conversation brushing past him like wind over still water. The luxury and spectacle were intoxicating for some, but for Terry, it was an exercise in detachment. He did not seek the applause, did not crave the stories whispered in his honor. He observed, catalogued, and calculated, aware that the reflections around him were fragments of a reality no longer entirely theirs to govern. The myth of BMF had taken on a life of its own, shimmering and distorted, growing in ways that could not be contained by strategy or foresight alone. In quieter moments, Terry caught himself studying the reflections of others, realizing that even within the mirrored walls of glamour, he remained invisible, not absent never, absent but present, in a way that required no validation, no acknowledgement. The brilliance of Meech's world cast its light unevenly, and Terry's was the shadow it illuminated. Yet he did not resent it. There was a bittersweet clarity in understanding that influence and perception were different currencies, and while Meech traded in the former, Terry managed the latter with quiet skill. The city beyond the banquet hall, reflected in tall windows, seemed to shift and ripple, a mosaic of streets, lights, and passing lives. Terry's mind traced the roots of operations, the flow of resources, the subtle dependencies that had once been invisible. Now, they were reflected back at him like a labyrinth of glass corridors, each echoing with the unintended consequences of visibility. He sensed the fragility inherent in fame, the way it could warp the intentions of those caught within its pull. And he understood, with a weight settling over his chest, that the legend forming around BMF was not entirely theirs anymore. It was a force with its own momentum, capable of moving beyond the reach of strategy, beyond the boundaries of loyalty, beyond the quiet discipline that had always been Terry's domain. The room's warmth contrasted sharply with the chill settling around Terry as he stepped away from the crowd, guided more by instinct than choice. In the hallway, the muted glow of sconces revealed polished surfaces, reflecting fragments of his own face in repeated, fractured angles. For a moment he paused, studying the image that looked back at him. It was him, undeniably, yet multiplied and distorted by the glass, by the aura of the party, by the myth that had begun to swirl around his family. He saw the careful lines of his jaw, the weight of vigilance in his eyes, the subtle tension that never left him, and in that reflection, he recognized the distance between the man he was and the story being told about him. The sounds of celebration trailed him like ghosts as he continued, echoing softly in empty corridors and polished stairwells. The laughter, the music, the clinking glasses, all part of a theater in which he had never chosen to perform. He felt the myth of BMF hovering at the edges of his vision, both luminous and untouchable, and he understood that while he had helped build it, it now existed independently, a reflection of ambition and legend rather than the measured reality he had cultivated. He paused again, this time before a tall, darkened window overlooking the city. Neon reflections shimmered faintly, and the streets below moved with an energy both distant and intimate, like a river scene from a high bridge. Terry studied the glass, the mirror of night, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself a quiet acknowledgement. The world had begun to tell its own story. The myth was no longer theirs to shape entirely. It had acquired a momentum all its own, and with that recognition came a soft, melancholy clarity. Control, he realized, was an illusion when placed against the tide of legend. The weight of observation pressed gently against him, a reminder that survival and influence were not always in the same hands. Meech would continue to navigate the lights, the laughter, the public gaze, and Terry would continue to anchor the unseen, the calculations, the contingencies, the quiet architecture that made each display possible. Their roles were complementary, yet increasingly distinct, and in that distinction lay both their strength and their solitude. Finally, Terry exhaled slowly, stepping back from the window, leaving the reflected city and the swirling legend behind. He could hear the faint echo of celebration, soft and distant, like a melody that belonged to someone else. And in that quiet distance, he understood fully. The empire they had built together was alive, luminous, and untethered. The myth of BMF had begun to grow beyond them, and in its glow, Terry accepted the fragile, luminous reality that he would endure it, not as a participant in the spectacle, but as the quiet, unseen force that made it possible. The city moved around Terry Flenory with a rhythm he had long understood: the hum of engines, the distant call of late-night vendors, the soft footsteps echoing against concrete. But lately, the cadence had shifted imperceptibly, almost beneath notice. A stillness had entered the spaces he had once considered familiar. It was not loud or violent. It did not announce itself with sirens or flashing lights. Instead, it was measured, patient. Like the slow tightening of a cord around a room, files were stacking, unmarked but heavy with implications. Conversations, once private and fleeting, now seemed recorded, catalogued, traced in ways invisible, yet undeniable. Terry sensed the change as one senses a shadow crossing a familiar path. It did not startle him, but it made him listen differently to the squeak of a floorboard, the faint clink of a pen against paper, the distant sigh of someone turning a folder in a dim office. The presence of watchers was everywhere, though nowhere at once. He moved through his world as he always had, calm, deliberate, meticulous. Each decision, each movement carried weight, but never panic. Operations ran smoothly because he had always built them on foresight, on layers designed to endure scrutiny. Yet, now, a subtle heaviness pressed against the edges of his days. The streets carried a whisper of inevitability. Cars idled in shadows, unremarkable to most, but he noticed the quiet pause of engines outside his building. Agents' eyes were invisible, their questions unspoken, their observation meticulous and unrelenting. Terry's mind worked in tandem with this new rhythm. He catalogued patterns, traced movements, assessed gaps with the same precision he had always applied to his enterprise. But this was different. This was not about opportunity or expansion. It was the slow constriction of space, the quiet closing in of forces he could not confront openly. The threat had no shape, no roar, no visible hand. It existed in pauses, in the silence between conversations, in the steady stacking of paper that carried judgment without accusation. Even in these quiet pressures, Terry maintained composure. He carried himself with grace, the same calm that had guided him through nights of uncertainty and rooms thick with tension. There was no display of dominance, no show of bravado. The weight was internal, carried in measured steps and eyes that missed nothing. His staff, loyal and disciplined, moved like shadows around him, aware yet untroubled, because the structure he had built absorbed shocks before they touched the surface. And yet, despite the seamless operation. Terry could feel the horizon shifting, the subtle knowledge that nothing, not even careful planning, could entirely contain the forces now, moving toward them. Evenings grew quieter, though the city never slept. Terry would step onto rooftops, lean against railings, and watch the roads stretch into the distance. The hum of traffic became a metronome, a reminder that life continued regardless of unseen observation. He reflected on choices, on timing, on the balance between exposure and control. There was an elegance in restraint, a subtle power in silence, but he knew that silence could only shield for so long. The world outside agents' laws, consequences was patient in a way few men could imagine. It did not rush. It did not make mistakes. It waited. Inside his office, late at night, the soft flicker of a desk lamp illuminated open ledgers and maps. Every number, every route, every contingency had been calculated. Yet now he traced lines, not for expansion, but for endurance. The hum of the city, the distant echoes of nightlife, and the occasional squeak of a chair were amplified in the stillness. Terry understood that the most dangerous moments often occurred in the quietest spaces, where a single oversight could unravel months of careful work. The psychological weight of observation settled over him like a slow tide. He was not afraid. Fear would have clouded his judgment, but he was aware, attuned. He could feel the gravity of history pressing against him, the imperceptible shaping of future events in rooms far from the streets he walked. It was a lesson in humility, in precision, in understanding that even the most intricate plans must reckon with forces that could not be fully foreseen. In moments of reflection, Terry thought of Meech, of the charisma that drew attention, of the ways in which visibility amplified both opportunity and risk. He understood, with quiet certainty, that the world now demanded a balance between boldness and discretion. Each choice would ripple outward, each error magnified in ways he had long prepared for, yet never experienced at this scale. The empire they had built required vigilance not only of action, but of perception. And perception, now, was a realm he could no longer entirely control. He stepped outside into the night, the cold air biting against his skin, grounding him in reality after hours spent in contemplation. The hum of distant traffic carried through the darkness, each engine, each footstep, each whisper of movement a reminder that the city had a life of its own, unforgiving, patient, and indifferent. Terry stood alone, shoulders squared, breathing measured, eyes scanning the horizon. The lights of the city flickered like distant constellations, beautiful and elusive, indifferent to ambition, to loyalty, to the careful calculus of a man who had long sought to bend circumstance to will. And in that stillness, he understood fully. The arrow was shifting beneath his feet. The quiet, methodical pressures he could not see had begun to shape the path forward. There was no dramatic raid, no sudden confrontation. There was only the patient accumulation of observation, of notes, of recorded movements, of subtle inquiry. Fate had entered the room, not with violence, but with precision, and its presence was undeniable. Terry's reflection lingered on the balance of control and inevitability. He was still the anchor, the strategist, the silent hand behind the machine. Yet even the most disciplined structure could feel the edges fray when the world's gaze grew relentless. For a long time, he remained on the curb, observing, breathing, feeling the wind, listening to the distant pulse of life around him. Every instinct, every calculation, every quiet discipline now had a new weight. A new urgency, tempered not by fear, but by awareness. The city whispered around him, infinite and indifferent. Terry exhaled, a soft acknowledgement of what had shifted. The horizon was changing. The empire he had helped shape remained solid, yet the air above it had grown thinner, and he could sense the approach of forces that measured not with flash or fire, but with patience, persistence, and quiet inevitability. And in that moment, Terry Flenory, silent, composed, deliberate, understood the truth he had long intuited. The net was tightening, and there was nothing to do but endure, adapt, and remain vigilant. The morning light was soft, pale against the concrete walls of Detroit's streets, and yet it carried with it a weight no sun could lift. Terry Flenory moved through it with the same deliberate steps he had cultivated over decades gone, precise, measured, but there was a subtle stillness in the air that he could not ignore. It was not chaos that heralded the end, nor the clamorous announcement of defeat. It was quiet, almost imperceptible. Doors opening, footsteps echoing against walls, the rustle of papers being handed over, each sound ordinary on its own, became a note in the slow dirge of an empire's passage. The arrests arrived not as spectacle but as inevitability. Terry had long understood the cycles of power, the delicate balance between ambition and consequence, and now he observed their final turn with composed acceptance. There was no shouting, no frantic scrambling, only motion giving way to stillness, the momentum of years folding quietly into memory. Around him, associates nodded, moved, followed instructions with an unspoken understanding. This was not a moment for fury, but for reflection. The city did not pause. It continued its indifferent rhythm, unaware of the weight it carried in silence. Terry's eyes traced familiar corners, the buildings where plans had been made, the streets where he had once walked unobserved, the corners where alliances had been cemented in whispered words. Each space now seemed to hold a memory, a residue of choices made with precision and care. He acknowledged them, not with regret, but with quiet recognition. The empire they had built together, his and Meech's, was not collapsing in flames. It was settling into history, leaving only echoes of its presence, subtle vibrations in the fabric of a city that had watched, largely unaware, as it grew. Inside his home, where once the pulse of business had thumped steadily against walls, there was a new rhythm, the careful closing of files, the folding of letters, the methodical cataloging of items once essential. Terry moved through it as a man who had mastered control, even in surrender. He understood that dignity lay not in resistance, but in presence, bearing the weight of legacy with composure, not defiance. There was no need to shout, no need to resist. Presence alone conveyed the measure of what had been built, the care with which it had been maintained, and the inevitability of its transition. Outside, vehicles waited with their quiet engines, officials moving with deliberate restraint. There was no urgency, no display of power, only procedure, only the slow, methodical progression toward closure. Terry walked calmly, each step measured, each movement intentional. The air carried the familiar scent of the city exhaust, mingling with cold asphalt and faint traces of frost, and he breathed it in as if to anchor himself, to feel the tangible, enduring world beneath his feet, even as another chapter of life quietly closed. The emotional weight of this moment was subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider. Yet within Terry, it resonated deeply. Years of strategy, of loyalty, of careful orchestration had led to this stillness. There was loss, yes, but also clarity, an understanding of what had been built, what it had cost, and the imprint it would leave long after doors closed behind him. He thought of those who had orbited the empire, the friends, the partners, the brothers, and each had contributed, each had sacrificed, and each now faced the quiet reflection that comes when motion ceases. It was a private reckoning, internal, dignified, almost tender. The world beyond continued unabated. Traffic flowed along cracked streets, pedestrians moved with indifferent purpose, and the city remained unaware of the profound significance of these still moments. Terry's fall was not a spectacle for the public to consume, but a transition for those who had lived the weight of it every day. The myth of BMF, the stories whispered in dimly lit rooms, the careful precision of logistics and loyalty, all were dissolving into quiet, becoming memory more than reality. He paused at the threshold, the soft scrape of his shoes against the floor echoing like a measured heartbeat. He did not resist. He did not flinch. There was no need. Acceptance was not surrender. It was presence. It was the recognition that history does not end with a roar. It ends with the subtle, persistent hum of life, moving forward, carrying memory, consequence, and reflection in its wake. The legacy he and Meech had shaped would endure in whispers, in recollection, in the quiet telling of stories, long after the doors had closed. And as he was led away, Terry took one last look at the city from which they had risen. The streets, the buildings, the faint glow of neon reflecting against rain-slick asphalt all held fragments of what had been, of what they had shaped, of what would survive in the hearts of those who remembered. There was sadness, yes, but it was tempered with understanding. The fall had not been violent. It had been inevitable, and in inevitability there was clarity, a rare dignity in the recognition that all things move through cycles, from motion to stillness, from creation to memory. No panic, no denial, only presence. He walked with measured steps, each one echoing faintly in the stillness, a rhythm that spoke of composure and reflection. Around him, life continued, indifferent to the small human dramas that had once shaped it so profoundly. The myth of BMF was no longer theirs to command, no longer theirs to influence, but it had left its mark. And in that mark, in the quiet dignity of surrender, Terry found a strange peace. The chapter closed not with spectacle, but with observation. The city carried on, unknowing, unsentimental, yet the echoes of years of careful planning and relentless discipline lingered in every corner. The empire had moved from motion to memory, from pulse to silence, and Terry Flenory, the quiet strategist, the shadow behind the brilliance, moved forward into history, carrying with him the weight, the lessons, and the dignity of all that had been achieved, knowing that even as doors closed, the story would not entirely vanish. It would whisper through time, soft and persistent, like the memory of a wind brushing against the city's streets in the quiet of dawn. Time, in its quiet insistence, began to mark Terry Flenory's world. It moved differently, here slower, deliberate, almost tactile, pressing against the edges of the small spaces he now inhabited. Corridors stretched endlessly in muted gray, polished floors reflecting the measured rhythm of footsteps that carried no haste. There was no urgency here, only the weight of repetition, the steady cadence of a life confined yet profoundly expansive in its interior landscape. The passage of days became a teacher, gentle and unyielding, imparting lessons in silence and observation. Letters arrived folded neatly, ink smudged slightly at the corners, their words carrying warmth, worry, love, and subtle hints of the world beyond the walls. Terry read them slowly, tracing sentences with fingers that had once mapped streets and empires. Each word was a tether to a past life, a bridge between the motion of ambition and the stillness of reflection. He memorized the lines, not as directives, but as whispers of connection, reminders of loyalty, and traces of family. In this environment, attention became profound. The smallest details, the curl of a paper edge, the faint scent of ink, the slight shift of sunlight through a high window took on resonance, speaking volumes to the quiet mind, willing to listen. Within these walls, Terry began to confront his choices not as judgments, not as regrets, but as points of understanding. The empire he had built with Meech, the paths they had charted together, the careful orchestration of risk and discipline, all of it now lived as memory, echoing through his mind like footsteps in an empty hall. He thought of alliances forged in trust, of conversations carried in shadows, of loyalty measured in subtle, imperceptible ways. Each recollection was a teacher, each memory a mirror, reflecting not only accomplishment, but responsibility, not only strategy, but consequence. The world outside continued, indifferent, its pulse unchanged by the quieted rhythms within. Seasons pass slowly, frost tracing delicate patterns on barred windows in winter, sunlight warming the narrow courtyard in spring, the soft hum of cicadas drifting in the distance as summer ripened. Terry marked these changes not as interruptions, but as reminders of continuity, of life moving onward even in confinement. In this slow-motion world, reflection became a form of survival, a tool for understanding rather than resisting the passage of days. Silence, once a companion only in strategy, became a teacher in its own right. It allowed Terry to hear himself, to measure the distance between intention and outcome. Every moment of stillness was a lesson in patience, a study in the subtle architecture of decision and consequence. He learned to observe the small how. Light touched a table, how the air shifted with a door opening, how shadows lengthened in the late afternoon. These were not trivial details. They were portals into presence, into awareness, into the human rhythms that persisted beyond ambition and empire. Time offered perspective. Terry saw not only what had been lost, but also what had been gained: resilience, clarity, an understanding of people, and loyalty that no rush or pressure could impart. The lessons were intimate, unspoken, carried in the measured breath, the tilt of a head, the slow closing of eyes at the end of each day. He explored the contours of memory with care, tracing patterns in both triumph and error, examining not only what he had achieved, but also what he had preserved: integrity, attention, the quiet discipline that had always defined him. He thought often of Meech, of the paths they had walked together and apart. There was admiration in memory, tinged with concern, with longing, and with a gentle sorrow for moments that could not be revisited. But even these emotions were tempered by the understanding that time, in its patient unfolding, had given him something the world outside could never offer: insight into himself. Every reflection was a conversation, every pause a question, every letter a reminder that life, even paused, continued to teach. Within the quiet corridors, Terry found ritual. He folded letters meticulously, arranged his few possessions with care, and walked the narrow halls as if mapping a world that existed now only in thought. There was no hurry, no performance. Movement became meditation, and the simple act of attending to the ordinary revealed the extraordinary rhythms of thought, patience, and endurance. Days bled into nights, nights into days, each cycle reinforcing the lessons of discipline, of measured response, of the profound depth hidden within stillness. He discovered solace in observation, the way light shifted across a floor, the subtle sound of a distant conversation, the slow turning of pages in books borrowed or gifted. In these moments, he was more human than at any point of public visibility, no image to maintain, number empire to protect, no expectation but the unfolding of reflection. Time shaped him gently, offering a rhythm in which regrets could be understood rather than relived, where hope could exist quietly alongside acknowledgement of cost, and where memory served as both teacher and companion. And finally, in a small patch of sunlight that filtered through a narrow window, Terry allowed himself to rest. He sat, eyes closed, breathing steadily, feeling the slow warmth spread across his face and shoulders. There was stillness, yes, but not emptiness. There was presence. There was understanding. A day passed, a season shifted, and in that simple alignment of body, mind, and moment, he discovered a fleeting peace. Here, in the measured flow of time, in the silent companionship of reflection, he was more fully alive than he had been amidst the motion and noise of empire. Time, once merely a tool of planning, of strategy, of caution, had become a teacher, companion, and witness. Through its quiet, deliberate insistence, Terry Flenory found a space to observe, to understand, to hold both the weight of his past and the possibility of his interior life. The empire may have fallen, the world may have shifted beyond the walls that now enclosed him, But within this measured solitude, he had discovered a clarity, a dignity, and a sense of human rhythm that no circumstance could take away. And so he sat, alone in the gentle sunlight, breathing steadily, present in a place defined by restraint, yet rich with understanding. Time had taught him patience, reflection, and the profound resonance of quiet. And in that stillness, he found a rare form of freedom, the freedom to know, to feel, and to endure. The world beyond the walls carried on as it always had, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires, to the quiet passage of lives that had shaped it in subtle, unseen ways. Terry Flenory's name, once spoken in hurried reverence or cautious acknowledgement, had settled into something quieter, softer. It traveled not through headlines or flashing cameras, but in the hushed corners of memory, in the rhythm of stories passed between friends, in the cadence of music that whispered of streets, loyalty, and ambition. The echo of a name has a peculiar quality. It does not demand attention, yet it lingers, bending time, threading through generations. Terry's life had been marked by careful observation, meticulous strategy, and an almost imperceptible patience that had guided him through triumph and turmoil alike. Now, in the stillness that followed, these qualities resonated differently. They were not merely markers of skill, but imprints of human intention, reminders that some influence is carried silently, like a river running beneath the visible surface of the world. The cities that had once hummed with his presence, Detroit, Atlanta, Los Angeles, still remembered him in small, scattered ways. A glance at a familiar corner, a whispered anecdote from an old friend, the echo of a conversation in a long-forgotten diner. These traces were not monuments, but threads, weaving his story into the tapestry of countless lives he had touched or merely observed from the shadows. The tone of legacy, of memory, is not loud. It does not demand celebration or condemnation. Terry had learned this over the long stretch of reflection, the quiet endurance of time. Ambition, brotherhood, choices, consequence, all carried weight, yet none defined the totality of a life. A name becomes more than a record of deeds. It becomes a vessel, holding the nuance of human presence. He thought of Meech often, of the roads they had walked, side by side, of the moments when light and shadow intertwined so closely that it was impossible to separate them. Their empire, their shared vision, had left a footprint in a world that continued regardless of the men who had shaped it. Scenes of memory drifted softly, like light filtering through curtains at dusk. Terry's mind wandered to quiet streets and cities where he had walked, two faces blurred by time yet etched in subtle recognition. He imagined the conversations in homes and back rooms, the tales recounted without naming him directly, yet carrying the essence of the man who had remained deliberately unseen. Old photographs, faded and curling at the edges, suggested moments of connection and ambition, of laughter shared and tensions endured. These images moved in and out of consciousness, unhurried, like clouds drifting across an endless sky. They were fragments, yet together they formed a whole that was neither legend nor cautionary tale, but simply memory. There is a peculiar intimacy in knowing that one's life continues to resonate, without the need for spectacle. The music that carried echoes of streets, of lives intertwined, played softly in memory, reminding listeners of choices made, of loyalty tested, of the subtle gravity of a brotherhood that had guided an empire. His influence was no longer measured in dominance or fear, but in quiet recognition, the understanding that actions, however concealed, ripple outward, shaping more than the immediate moment, imprinting themselves on the rhythm of collective consciousness. Time, as it always does, softened the edges. The urgency of ambition faded, replaced by reflection. Terry recognized that the measure of a life is not in the visible triumphs or the loud failures, but in the subtle persistence of presence, the way one's decisions, one's silence, one's attentiveness, reverberate long after the world has moved on. He considered the paths he had chosen, the risks measured, the loyalty extended and preserved. Each memory was a note in a quiet symphony, a harmony of intention and consequence that continued to play, softly, beyond the reach of the man who had once orchestrated it. Even as the cities moved on, even as streets were rebuilt, and new names emerged in the spaces he had once occupied, his life carried a resonance that could not be erased. Not fame, not notoriety, but understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of presence, of a life lived with purpose, with care, with unspoken vigilance. There was dignity in this recognition, a subtle comfort in knowing that the echo of a name does not demand to be heard. It simply is, carried by memory, by the spaces between words, by the lingering sense of someone who once moved deliberately, carefully, and invisibly through a world that often mistook quiet for absence. Rain began to fall, lightly at first, the soft rhythm on window panes and streets echoing the pace of memory itself. It was a natural cadence, unremarkable yet deeply resonant, washing over the landscape without judgment, without ceremony. Terry watched it, feeling the echo of his own story dissolve into the rhythm of time, carried by droplets that connected past, present, and the unrecorded traces of future reflection. There was no need for finality, no desire for applause or condemnation, only acceptance, a recognition that life had unfolded in full, complex, human measure. And in that quiet acceptance, the last traces of the empire, the ambition, the brotherhood, and the intricate architecture of decisions fell into place, not as a monument to be scrutinized, but as a presence to be understood. The name Terry Flenory, once held close in the shadows of ambition, moved outward into the world in subtle ways. A story whispered between friends, a reference in song, a nod in conversation, a shadow of influence in the quiet pulse of streets that would never forget entirely, even if they could not remember fully. The echo of a name is not loud. It does not demand attention. It persists in the spaces between sound, in the pause between memory and imagination. Terry Flenory's name dissolved into the quiet rhythm of time, carried by reflection, by remembrance, by the simple, persistent heartbeat of human story. And as the rain fell, soft and unhurried, it was enough, for a life had been lived, choices made, and the legacy of memory, patient and enduring, continued to travel. Long after the man himself had stepped back into stillness,